His name is Duncan Campbell. Duncan, welcome to the show, and I hope and I can see from the glow on your face you're doing well. Thanks for joining us. The proximate reason for inviting you this evening, and thanks for accepting, is that the Metropolitan Police, led by its effectively Crime Commissioner, the Mayor of London, Sadiq Khan, are now in special measures. That's quite serious, isn't it?
It is very serious, and there are very good reasons why it is in this position. I like to try and explain what special measures means, because I think it's one of those expressions, a bit like fit for purpose or institutionally corrupt, that I think people are a little uncertain about. It basically means that things have gone from bad to worse there over the last few years, and they are now in limbo to a certain extent in the Metropolitan Police. The previous commissioner, Cressida Dick, resigned in February, and we're now in July. We're still not expected to get a new commissioner until next month at the earliest. They're down to the last two candidates for the job. But it is a mess, and it's not just the Met. The Met gets all the attention because London, as you know, George, is where all the journalists are. But there are at least three other forces in the police in Britain under special measures, as they call it. And so it is a problem that is affecting all of the police in this country.
Now, many cynics blame Cressida Dick. They say that she got the gig not because she was the best police officer in London. She got it despite being in charge of the murderous killing of Jean-Charles de Menezes, the Brazilian electrician, shot by mistake in the London Underground. But actually, the men that came before her weren't up to much either, were they?
No, there's been a lot of bad leadership of the Metropolitan Police for many years. I often refer to, I think, probably the most successful Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police, who was Sir Robert Mark, who, if you remember, you're just old enough to remember, George, came in the 1970s, at a time when Scotland Yard particularly was fantastically corrupt. And he came in, he said his aim was to arrest more criminals than he employed. And he got about 50 of his officers, detectives, who were deeply corrupt, were prosecuted. Another 300 left rather than face disciplinary procedures. And he made a real effort. He encouraged the police to talk to the press, which is something we can maybe come on to later, which they hadn't been before. They were very, very reticent about talking to the police. And he kind of embodied what Sir Robert Peel, who founded the Metropolitan Police in 1829, is often quoted, whether he actually said it or not, it doesn't really matter, but it's attributed to him, which is the police are the public and the public are the police. In a way, you get the kind of police force that you deserve. But I think the feeling has been over the last few years that we don't deserve some of the things that have happened. The most obvious being this horrible murder by a serving police officer, Wayne Couzens, of Sarah Everard, problems that arose in demonstrations following that, but also some very, very badly bungled murder investigations and bungled sex offense investigations in which completely innocent people were named and investigated and so on. So it's been a long time coming, but things are very serious now. And there are a lot of reasons. And I think my argument about it is that yes, the Met is in a mess, but there are a number of reasons for it, and the government is very happy to let the Met take the heat for a lot of the mistakes that they've made. When Theresa May was Home Secretary and then Prime Minister, she cut the number of officers by more than 20,000. She cut the number of staff, support staff, by 23,000. And also, half the police stations in Britain have been closed over the last 10 years. More than 600 of them. And that's one way that the police establish a relationship with the public. There's a place, it's kind of like the death of the pub and the death of the church and the death of the post office in this country. The government has been frantically selling off the family silver, and they've got rid of half of the magistrates' courts in England and Wales, sold off one round the corner from me here in Bethnal Green, is now an extremely expensive hotel. You can stay there for 300 quid a night. Used to be a magistrate's court where I used to go and see naughty people being ticked off by a magistrate. So the government have not given the police the kind of backing they deserve, or the leadership, and they have made a mess of the criminal justice system in this country.
We could talk all night about what you have just said. It was a tour de horizon without peer, actually. It identified just about every single issue that has arisen, not just in Cressida Dick's time, but going back decades. Let's take just one of them. I passed a very shishi cafe, which is called the Old Police Box.
Yeah.
I'm so old, I remember, no, never mind police stations, but police boxes. So there was a station, but there was also a box. And there were pairs of police officers who would walk around the housing estate, housing scheme that I grew up on, would be looking for evidence of criminality, of course, but their very presence was intended to be a deterrence to gangs, to people up to no good. And they would repair to their police box. You could go to the police box and talk to them. Many did. There was a phone in the police box at a time when hardly any of us had phones, and you could just pick it up and you were through to the station. The station was local. People had a relationship to the police that they simply don't have now. So if Robert Peel was right, and that the public are the police and the police are the public, that is well and truly severed now, isn't it?
It is. I mean, I've kind of expected, because you know where I live, which is very near Hackney Road in East London. I'm sort of anticipating that you will hear a sound of the police at some stage with a siren going past. And that is most people's experience, is a blue flashing light and a siren. I can't think the last time I actually saw one in uniform wandering around. They used to be mocked, bobbies in bicycles 2x2 and so on like that. And, you know, although this is created as a sort of magical time, you have to remember at that particular time in the 60s and 70s, they were fantastically, the detective branch were fantastically corrupt. One former commissioner who I knew remained in uniform all his career. And he said that it was so difficult to be a detective without having, on your first job, somebody tucking some pound notes in your top pocket from a raid or from a bribe or whatever. So while the police were on the street and people felt secure, that was going on in the background. But now we have a situation, there is not that institutional corruption within the detectives anymore. Detectives are now subject to much stricter controls than they ever were when I first started writing about them in the 70s. But what has happened is that the police have been completely detached. And as I mentioned earlier, the closure of all these police stations, like the closure of banks and everything else we're talking about, detaches people from them. And so people, the only form of communication is by a phone or an email or Twitter or whatever. And that, you know, and I think whoever it becomes the new commissioner, that's one issue that they have to address. On the other hand, I mean, just to put it in a tiny bit of context, I was looking this up before I came on. At least we don't have a trigger-happy police force. I was looking at the number of fatalities caused on civilians by the police in this country. For this year, it's 0. In America, it's 497. Last year in this country, it was 1. In America, it was up 1,055 people shot dead by police officers. So we have to balance that at least we have the least trigger-happy police in the world. But we now have an extremely embattled police, both the Metropolitan Police and others. And I do believe that they've been very badly let down by, and in other ways by the government, in that the police, particularly during COVID, were left with the business of clearing up all of other society's errors. The poverty, the homeless people, the police are meant to deal with them. The alcoholics, the drug addicts that you see on the street, particularly not far from here, that's lumbered with the police. Instead of a government that is dealing with all of these problems, they're leaving it to them. And you see Priti Patel, the Home Secretary, and Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister, occasionally dressing up in police uniforms. It's bizarre. It's like two children at a fancy dress party going along if there's a big drugs raid or something like that, but doing nothing to address the fact that Britain has the largest number of people in prison per head of population of any other country in Western Europe. And that creates the problems for the police. They come out, they have nowhere to go, and you have our prisons, many of them privatized, are kind of the universities for crime. They're producing more and more criminals. There is none of that rehabilitative stuff, which you will remember from the special unit in Barlini that produced great artists and none of that is going on. The prisons are so full so overcrowded that none of the education, none of the training for work that should go on, and it's the police that are left to deal with those problems when they come out of prison.
Very well said. Now, you moved on from reporting on all these things to fictionalize them. And a very fine crime writer you turned out to be. When you watch these crime series on television, you know, Line of Duty and so on, how close to reality do you think that is?
Well, I like Line of Duty, but I mean, the idea that undercover officers, you'd have an undercover officer kind of spying on other undercover officers in the same police station is ludicrous. But, you know, that's fiction. I mean, funnily enough, I've just been there is an inquiry into undercover policing going on in London at the moment. It's been going on, it's cost £50 million so far. It's been going on for a number of years. And I went along last month because giving evidence was somebody called Detective Sergeant Roy Creamer, who I remember when I worked at Time Out magazine, raided Time Out. We had a victim inside. He's now 93, and he was giving evidence about how the police infiltrated the left in the late 60s, early 70s. You would have enjoyed it. And he went through the different, everything from the International Marxist Group to the anti-Vietnam War campaign to Socialist Workers' Party and everything. How the anarchists, of course, because he was talking about Stuart Christie, the late anarchist and an old friend of mine who was jailed in Spain for trying to assassinate General Franco. But he was describing all of that and the police infiltrating all these different left-wing groups, coming up with absolutely nothing dangerous. Nobody was planting bombs. Nobody was doing anything particularly dangerous. They were having rowdy campaigns and so on. And so it was interesting to see that you had all of that amount of effort being put into infiltrating the left, as it were. But at the same time, that was the time when the British National Party and Combat 18 and so all the different right-wing groups were gathering, but they were all concentrating on the anarchists and the Marxists anyway. So that was an example of fantastic amount of wasted time and effort. You would have enjoyed it.
I hope you and I are still spilling beans at 93. Duncan Campbell, as I say, this could go on all night. I wish it could. We'll need to do a special. Thanks very much indeed for joining us on the mother of all talk shows.